Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Documentruth. Our goal for the show will be to help highlight some of the most pressing social and environmental issues of our time. In this series, which I've called Environmental Growing Pains, we're going to discuss overpopulation, which I believe to be the leading cause of our declining resources, wars, and changing climate. Joining us today to help us better understand overpopulation and our addiction to growth is Dave Gardner. Dave is the Executive Director of World Population Balance, founder of Citizens Powered Media, and producer of the groundbreaking film Gorwthbusters Hooked on Growth. With us now is Dave Gardner. Welcome to Documentruth, Dave.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, we're happy to have you here. Could you begin by telling us a little bit about yourself, Dave, and what got you thinking about the world as being overpopulated?
I'll try to give you the short answer to that question. I'm 61 years old, fairly privileged white male in the United States of America. These days, I've been a documentary filmmaker. I've been a filmmaker all of my adult life and chose to move toward documentaries about 10 or 15 years ago. I became interested and concerned about overpopulation primarily when I observed in the American West challenges related to drought. I live in the state of Colorado, and we get, if we're lucky where I live, maybe 15 inches of rain every year on average, not really enough to sustain the population centers along the Front Range of Colorado. And yet I was observing during the 90s, especially, I was observing this huge growth boom, and it seemed that all of the cities were competing for population growth. And the state, in fact, even to this day, believes that somehow our economy depends on us continuing to entice companies to move to the state. And no one really kind of connects that behavior with the fact that that means that the population of the state will keep growing. And I just thought that's a little bit odd. At first I thought about it while we were in a drought year where water was particularly challenging, but it turns out even when we're having normal years precipitation-wise, the state of Colorado, and in fact every western state in the United States does not have the water to really support a growing population, let alone just the population that we have in the western U.S. So it seemed silly to me that everybody's prosperity strategy was based on growth. So that was what kind of got me starting to look into population dynamics at the local, state, national, and eventually even at the world level.
According to the latest reports from the United Nations, the world population stands at approximately 7 billion people. But I've read more recently that those numbers could be more accurately calculated at 8.5 to 9 billion people. While conducting your research on growth, did you find any scientific estimations that would be considered a sustainable world population number for the planet, Dave?
Well, let me tell you that I won't give you my estimation because what do I know? I certainly have a fair amount of expertise just because I've researched this subject for the documentary Gorwthbusters and also for all of my ongoing work with World Population Balance and Gorwthbusters. But I really turn to the scientists who have done serious inquiry into this and base my answer on that.
Right.
And the people that have done the most serious work end up kind of congregating in around the 2 to 3 billion mark.
Okay.
Far below the 7. We know we're over 7 billion today. God help us if we're really over 8 already, or even closer to 9. But it's clear that that's unsustainable. I haven't run into. I'll tell you what. There is one scientist who estimated that just based on feeding the world alone, that if the world went completely vegetarian, no more livestock, that he calculated that the world might be able to support 10 billion people. But he wasn't doing any. He wasn't looking at carbon emissions, climate disruption. He wasn't looking at other scarce resources. He wasn't looking at the freshwater crises that we're facing. Of course, eliminating livestock production makes a big dent in all of those things. It would certainly it would help us to scale back our carbon emissions, and it would help us to deal with water, because livestock is a water-intensive agricultural practice.
Absolutely. I saw a documentary, I think it was last year, called, you've probably seen it, Cowspiracy. And that really opened up my eyes to the the agribusiness, and the amount of water that is used to keep it going. It's definitely not sustainable. But one of the things that I was I was a little bit sad that I felt a little bit sad that they didn't address overpopulation, and it seems like there's definitely a documentary, that needs to be made, and I think there's a few out there, but that would really address the the problem of overpopulation, because it seems to me that it's really the growing number of people and the amount of water and resources that we consume that is the leading cause of the declining resources on the planet.
It's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. This I frequently hear from people who want to push back when they discover that I'm talking about sustainable population and trying to drive home the point that we are overpopulated and need to be contracting our population. Frequently, I hear from people who really are pushing the vegetarian or vegan lifestyle, and they're doing that largely as a solution to the crises that we're up against, largely with regard to food, water, and carbon emissions. And they say, why are you trying to get us to do something about world population if all we need to do is stop eating meat? Well, that solves temporarily a few of the problems. It doesn't solve all the problems, and it's probably going to be just as difficult. And I'm not making it my crusade. I actually would rather have a world with 2 billion people in it, and maybe everybody gets to have a cheeseburger every other month or something like that. I think it's just as easy to get people to plan small families as it is to get people to give up meat.
I would agree. I mean, I certainly respect people who choose to live vegetarian lifestyle. My sister is a vegan, actually, and I know that it's a difficult lifestyle to live, and it's honorable,
Yes.
But personally, I'm a meat eater. I'm actually a hunter as well. I prefer to feel a connection to the food that I go after. I have my own garden. I hunt for my own food, and that's kind of the connection that I like to have with it. I know where the food is coming from, but interestingly, which I think a lot of vegans would really appreciate. More recently, I've seen that there's some scientific study on actually growing meat, which would really change the industry. And they're talking, they're actually able to grow meat, which sounds a bit crazy now on a petri dish. But this is really, I think, going to be the future. So we can have, we'll not have to have this huge, big agriculture business killing animals and so on and so forth, but yet we'll be able to have the that taste that we're all going after.
Yeah, I just wonder if we're going to. I wonder about the taste. Probably a move in the right direction, but I also wonder. Let me play devil's advocate here a little bit.
Yeah.
What are the unintended consequences, and what is the next step then that we will take if we decide that's what we have to do because we absolutely refuse to acknowledge that there are too many human beings on the planet. So the first step we're going to take is we're going to start culturing meat in a petri dish. Then the end state is, I would really highly recommend you watch it if you haven't seen it before. There's this old science fiction movie starring Charlton Heston called Soylent Green.
Okay.
And it seemed a little bit extreme and ridiculous when it first came out. And gosh, it must have been in the 60s, I think, 1960s. But if you look at that today, I think if you look at it objectively, you couldn't help but say, wow, they were actually anticipating the future. And it's a future in which, really don't want to spoil it, but I know most people aren't going to go out and find that film. But Charlton Heston eventually discovers that the food that everyone is eating is actually recycled human beings. That when people die, they're sent off to this factory, and their bodies are converted into these little wafers that people line up at the town square to get their rations of Soylent Green. That's the name of the little wafer that you have to get in order to survive, and it's made from dead human beings. And you know what? That's probably the ultimate reuse, probably good environmental stewardship. But in the process, they've created a world where people are stepping over one another. There really is almost a human being per square meter or yard. Certainly, all of the good things in life have kind of disappeared. And in fact, when the people, it's an amazing scene where the people aren't, something interrupts the food supply, and so the people are rioting in the town square. And the way the authorities deal with that is they just send these huge garbage trucks in, and the garbage trucks scoop the people up and then dump them into the back of the truck and just drive off with the people there. We're reduced to being treated, the worst of how we treat livestock today, human beings are treated in this science fiction fantasy. And it is a fantasy, but we are slowly, inch by inch, year by year, working our way in that direction, simply because we refuse to just say, wow, there's too many of us on the planet, and it would be, the responsible thing to do would be for us to never see a 4-child family or even a 3-child family. All the good people of the world who really want to raise a lot of children should be heading down to the adoption agency, and you can have a large family that way, but you do not need to have 6 people carrying your genetic legacy into the future. I'll get off my soapbox. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I'm going to scare you a little bit here. In my family, I come from Ireland, and the culture, back in the in the 60s, 70s, was Ireland's predominantly Christian, and a
lot of Catholics,
and Protestants, and they had big families. And my grandmother, she just turned 90 years of age, but she had 16 kids.
Oh my gosh!
And that's although they lived on a farm, and they it was all hands on deck. Everybody had a job. That was the thing to do back then. And at that time, probably I don't know the numbers here, but I think in around the 60s and 70s, the world population at that time was only in around 3 or 4 billion. So it might have been sustainable. The resources for the amount of people at that time, but we've certainly got away from that, and the effects of big families. We're dealing with that obviously today with the declining resources.
I want to just point out about your grandmother. My parents had 4 children. I don't judge them. I don't judge your grandmother because I don't believe that this was on their radar screen when they were making those choices. But I am now devoting my life to making sure it is on the radar screen of every young couple today, so that they can make appropriate decisions based on what we know. You're right that population was under 4 billion back then, but of course having 16 children wasn't a wasn't a sustainable behavior then, because we needed to be stabilizing the population at worst at that point in time. And, and you mentioned the farm lifestyle. We still have experienced that a lot in Africa, where the fertility rates are higher, and there are still, while they are moving to urban centers in greater numbers, there are still a lot of people living off the land, and people try to kind of rationalize the large families in Africa, saying, well, they need those larger broods in order to do the farm work.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think about that generation to generation, let's just take your grandmother, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say your grandparents had I don't know how much land for their farm.
At that time, they probably had about 20 acres, which was an awful lot for Ireland, yeah.
But imagine, okay, the next generation, there were 16 kids to divide that.
Right.
Okay, so there's not even an acre, or barely an acre per family in the next generation. And if each of those children had 16 children, then,
Mm-hmm.
In just 2 generations, the land, that 20 acres wouldn't support that one family.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you can kind of project on into a global scale, you can understand why at some point we just have to say enough is enough.
Yeah, and there was a book that I read recently, and I have to give you and David Paxson credit. I watched you have a podcast. Just remind me of the name again.
The Overpopulation podcast.
The Overpopulation podcast, and you have another podcast as well. Is that right?
Yeah, I just started one called Paving Paradise.
Paving Paradise. Okay, so it was the podcast that you done with David Paxson, and the book that you were interviewing a lady, Karen Schrag.
Yes.
And talking about her book, Moving Upstream, and that book I went out and purchased, and it was absolutely an amazing book. I really took a lot from it, but what the book was addressing, and you'll know about this, is the fact that all the underlying causes or the underlying problems on the earth today stem from overpopulation, and it seems like there's a lot of activists, a lot of politicians beating their drum over environmental problems, climate problems, and so on. But they're not really openly discussing the most serious of all of them, and of course it's overpopulation. And that book really got to the heart of it, and it called a lot of people out. She didn't hold any. She didn't hold any. She was guns blazing there. Although she respects a lot of the people that she's asked to address these things.
I thought she did a real good job of expressing the fact that she really respected them, but that they were missing this key thing. And I have this list in front of me that I always pull up whenever I'm doing an interview. It's called my Overshoot Checklist. We're an overshoot, and you look at the list. Fertile soil is disappearing. Freshwater crises are happening now and projected to intensify. A lot of our freshwater is polluted to the point that we can't eat the fish. We have large ocean dead zones, oceans acidifying, deserts expanding, rainforests shrinking, species extinction at an alarming rate, and food scarcity. And you can find silos of environmentalists and social justice activists and NGOs and others working on every one of those items. But they're working on, let's say, rainforest shrinking. They're working on plans to protect rainforests and plans to stop the continued destruction of them. But what they're not working on, as Karen pointed out, is they're not working on the underlying cause, which is more people on the planet. And I think, tell me if I'm wrong, but I thought Karen did a good job of saying, they're doing important work, and I'm not asking them to stop doing that work, but they need to add not just a footnote, but a big headline to their work, which says, by the way, at the same time, our work will be for naught if we cannot rein in population growth and actually begin contracting
Hmm.
our population back to a sustainable level.
Yeah, and I get it. I mean, I had fears myself of talking about this. If you try to speak about this problem with, I have a big Catholic family, and if I try and talk about overpopulation, it's like, you know, uh, I'm the devil. So I understand that there's fear on behalf of the environmentalist politicians, and those people to really come out and address this, but it's got to the point where you know the effects of not doing anything is really, and people don't understand, our planet is going down the drain at such an alarming rate. I've got two girls, and I don't know if there's going to be a planet here for those girls in the future. And people might say, oh, come on, and I would say, no, seriously, you really need to go out and start doing your research, and start learning about this stuff, because unless we do something soon, we're going to be in a world of hurt here.
Yeah, it's happening just slowly enough, not as slowly as many people think, and I can see that you recognize that. But it's also a little bit out of sight for people in the industrialized world. If you're living in Chicago or Los Angeles or Seattle or Denver,
Hmm.
you go to the supermarket and there's still food on the shelves
Hmm.
today, and
Hmm.
you can still afford it.
Hmm.
So it does seem it's a little bit hard to get people to understand it. So there's a lot of ignorance about it, and then and as you point out, there's this. It's almost hard for me to understand how why politicians run for the hills when you want to talk about overpopulation. Journalists dance around it. Uh, I think people like you and I probably hope that maybe the work we're doing will somehow shift that paradigm and make it okay. We're talking about it, and the more people like you who do this work, and thank you for doing it, eventually maybe it will be okay
Hmm.
to talk about it. And of course, if you can't talk about it, it's pretty hard to uh, make people aware of it and help people understand what they can do about it. And I apologize for interrupting and running off at the mouth
Oh,
like
no,
this,
go
but
ahead. You're
that,
you're.
it's solvable. A
Hmm.
lot of people, if the people who are aware of it, once you make them aware of it, they the first thing they'll say is, well, gosh, what are we going to do about it? We're not going to. Everyone has a right, everyone has a right to have as big a family as they want. We're not going to be able to legislate family size, so we're just stuck with this situation. And I would say, well, I don't think today we're at a point where I'm not sure. I would not say that we need to be trying to pass a one-child policy in the United States, for example. Uh, Talk about a taboo that would go nowhere. But I honestly do believe that if couples of childbearing age are armed with the facts about the repercussions of their family size decisions on the quality of life of their very children that they're creating, that they would voluntarily and humanely say, "I'm not going to bring 4 kids into the world to starve."
Yes.
Uh, and
Yes.
and it's interesting that if we could really start getting the word out and actually change the culture,
Hmm.
that you'd be surprised that just by the end of this century,
Hmm.
we could, instead of being at 11 billion, as the United Nations is currently projecting,
Hmm.
we could actually be well on our way down toward 2 billion, and we could be below 3 billion
Hmm.
by the end of this century if we, tomorrow, if we could snap our fingers and change the global average fertility rate to 1 instead of 2.5 that it is today.
Hmm.
That in the lifetime of your children, the world could be back at a sustainable population level, and most people they don't get that. They assume that all the growth is baked into the cake, and that there's nothing you can do about it.
Hmm. I think you're right on there. If people really knew the effects of having adding another child, or that's having on the planet, the real effects. And I think that's part of the problem, and you kind of spoke about it there. Um, we're really not feeling the effects of our overconsumption. We're not feeling the effects of our geographical location, and you know, we're not so expanding that geographical footprint. We've now burdened other parts of the planet with our need for consumption. You have you hear about different parts of the world, like India. There's a new documentary just recently come out called "The True Cost," and that documentary talks about um, the clothing industry and these basically labor shops where people are just, they're asked to produce something like 60 garments an hour. They're allowed only one toilet break per day, and it's just absolutely ridiculous. And we're so removed from that, we really don't see these effects. And the analogy I use, if I was to pinch you, Dave, on the arm, you would immediately feel it, and you would probably pinch me back, you know. But
Uh-huh.
it's unfortunate because we've disconnected ourselves from nature and its laws, and most of us have lost our connection to the earth and that instinctual sense of the impending dangers that that we're creating. That's just kind of my angle on it. Had you any thoughts on that? By the way, I often hear people who are quite aware of of the problems we're creating. They talk about nature and how we've kind of removed ourselves from nature. Have you any thoughts on that kind of perspective?
Well, first of all, I just want to say bravo, bravo, ditto, ditto for everything you just said. You really, I am so impressed with your grasp of that. Uh, we read about the filthy air in China, and what we don't read about is the fact that that a lot of that filthy air in China is a result of them making products for us to buy and consume in Europe and the United States. We have exported our pollution. And so that makes it a little bit more invisible. So I would just say, yes, this is one of the impacts of globalization that's negative. Globalization, it turns out, isn't all it's cracked up to be, because it does allow us to hide a lot of the impacts of our behavior from ourselves. And it has also the urbanization, which we've been experiencing for 100 years, and it seems to be in overdrive now, makes it so that we are even less close to nature. So it is very difficult for us to maintain, as a civilization, maintain our appreciation for and our connection with nature. There are so many people who don't really know where their food comes from. They think it comes from a box in the frozen food aisle at the supermarket.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll mention one other thing related to that question, and that is I kind of look at it as a rubber band. We're living on borrowed time. We discovered the tremendous power of fossil fuels, of burning oil, 150 years ago. And during the last 100 years, we got really serious millions of years of stored sunlight in the form of fossil fuels, and that has allowed us to temporarily live way beyond the means of the planet. And so we have, if you're looking at what the planet can really sustain, how much human life, we've stretched this rubber band, and fossil fuels have allowed us to do that. However, we are now starting to see that rubber band snap back,
Mm-hmm.
and it's either going to snap back really hard and not be very pleasant if we continue to live in ignorance of what we're doing, and come back to its normal size more elegantly if we would just wake up and realize, one, that there need to be a lot fewer of us, and soon. And I would say, when you're this far into Overshoot, working on the population angle alone isn't enough. We really do need to seriously scale back our consumption, and that could in fact even mean that we ought to go vegan, or as close to vegan as possible, maybe temporarily, maybe for 100 years, maybe permanently. But
Mm-hmm.
I tell you, we can't we cannot continue to live the way we have been living in the Western world
Mm-hmm.
while we shrink global population, because we've got that rubber band stretched way too far.
Mm-hmm. A good friend of mine used the analogy, his name is Michael Horn, he used the analogy that there's the pendulum effect, and now you turn that pendulum into a wrecking ball. So you have this big wrecking ball, it's a pendulum, and it's going out, you swing it out, and this is the things that we've created, and now it's going to come back, and it's going to cause destruction. And I hate to be so doom and gloom about it, but
You read my mind. That's where we are right now
yeah,
at this moment.
it really is a doom and gloom situation, and I try to enjoy myself, enjoy and live for today, but I can't help but read the news and research this stuff and really begin to understand that it is a problem. I'd like to shift gears just a little bit for the benefit of the audience. On a more local level, it can help to understand the growth systems which we have in place. This is an area that you've thoroughly researched and learned that there's a bit of a myth surrounding the advantage of growth. Could you talk a little bit about that? You've, in recent years, produced a documentary called Gorwthbusters, and done a lot of research, which would be quite interesting for a lot of people.
Okay, thanks for that opportunity. Yeah, when in producing the Gorwthbusters documentary, I did have to, I guess, become a little bit of an expert on our culture of growth, and that's what I set out to do with that film, was to explore the culture of growth, put a spotlight on it, and make it okay to question that. And I think what's really happened is that, the last few hundred years of human history, maybe even more than a few hundred years, the human civilization has been almost like a virus expanding across the globe. And really, just a few hundred years ago, when the Europeans began to settle North and South America, they were finally getting to the last untapped resources on the planet. They'd pretty well overrun Europe, and a lot of Asia were filling up, and yet we had these North America and South America just looked like a gold mine for us. And so during the last 150, 200 years, we have overrun those two continents, and now we really don't have anywhere else to go. I guess we're looking into the Arctic.
Mm-hmm.
It's becoming almost economical for us to explore the Arctic for oil and other scarce resources.
And that's going to be a problem. It seems like Canada and Russia are really starting to butt heads now on that, and who knows how that'll turn out.
But that's brutal. Those are the brutal extremes of the planet. Very expensive, very delicate, and so when that's where you're going for resources, that you've pretty well tapped all of the easy stuff. So but we've got into this habit. It's become habituated. For 1,000 years anyway.
Mm-hmm.
There's always been somewhere else for us to expand,
Mm-hmm.
and so we have come to equate expansion with prosperity.
Mm.
Every time you find a new plot of land that you can farm, or a new area that you can mine, you get rich.
Mm-hmm.
We've been extracting wealth from the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where this myth comes. We've got this myth that prosperity comes from growth. And it actually wasn't a myth for a long time. But now it is, because now we've filled up the planet, and now it's very expensive. Each additional increment of growth comes at a huge cost. For a great example would be the cost of drilling for oil in the Arctic. Or let's look at, Richard Branson apparently is thinking about how we're going to mine asteroids, so that we do not have to stop and say, okay, enough is enough. We filled up the planet. There's yet another frontier that we can explore and exploit.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's ever going to happen. But if it did, I mean, the expense would be enormous. And if you really do true accounting for that, it turns out the cost of that exploitation far exceeds any of the benefits. And so the prosperity, we think we get additional prosperity from a community adding another subdivision, or from buying more cars this year in the United States than we did last year.
Mm-hmm.
We've just come to not question that. We just assume, wow, that's good. That's prosperity.
So what you're telling me is that there's an artificial cost that is allowing this growth to happen. So we're really the true cost would be much higher. Is that?
Yeah, because we do not account for the climate disruption.
Mm-hmm.
We don't account for the loss of species from the planet. We do
Mm-hmm.
not account for the increasing toxification
Mm-hmm.
of the places that we're living. That just doesn't go into the equation. Great example right here in Colorado. Colorado is one of the fronts of fracking. We have some significant natural gas deposits, and the only way to exploit those is by fracking.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a governor who continues to tell us that, that we have to allow fracking even in and near our population centers. We have to allow them to inject toxic chemicals into the ground.
That's just crazy.
Because if we don't, it will destroy our state's economy. Okay, so we basically have to toxify our environment, make our kids sick, or kill them in order to have a healthy economy. Those costs are not. He does not subtract those health and environmental costs from the gross state product when he's doing the math.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it's sad but true.
Yeah, and there's no education there. These politicians are they're really not educated in the environmental impacts of that. People can, it's like all sorts of. I think this last couple of years, the amount of earthquakes has gone up tenfold, and this stems back to fracking and pulling the oil out of the ground and these things. It's like I've heard somebody use the analogy that the fluid that you have between your joints. Could you imagine pulling all of that fluid out of your joints? How they would just rub together, and it's basically we're pulling that fluid, that oil out of the ground, and it's totally destructive to the earth. And this is where we have this increase of earthquakes and volcanic, more volcanoes, all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, and we're also injecting, all the toxic chemicals that we're using to do the fracturing. Most of those come back up, not all of it, but then we go drill another well and inject that into the underground to store. And I think that's a major contributor to the earthquakes as well. And no one is wondering, geez, what happens? Eventually, won't we have so much of that toxic disposal waste stored underground that it's going to go somewhere. It's going to come back and bite us.
Yeah, leaking into the aquifers.
Yeah. Eventually, it may. Yeah.
Absolutely.
But we don't look that far down the road, and I really do think it's this culture. It's this culture of growth that keeps us from doing the full math. Because if you're questioning that, if you're wanting to regulate the fracking industry, or if you're wanting to prevent them from fracking, near population centers, and at least, and the truth is that we ought to just end fracking. But you're against economic growth, and economic growth, it turns out, is the holy grail. That is the one common denominator around the world. That is the single highest public policy goal in the world. And very few people dare to question that. And that, it turns out, is the root of our really of all of our problems, including the population growth problem.
Yes, I would like to give people some hope here, and
Good idea.
we've we've talked a lot about overpopulation. We've talked about the systems that are in place on a local level, and I would like to, on a local level, try to arm people with some knowledge so that what can people do on a local level? What can people do to help us change direction here?
Some of the things that give me a lot of hope, and I thank you for asking that question. There are people around the world who are working very intelligently on solutions to these problems. And so you just need to look around. You're not alone if you're concerned about this, and if you want to become activated around it. You're not the only one in your community. And I find that it really helps to hang out with other like-minded people. It's like going to church. It's enjoyable, and there's this mutual support network, and you learn from each other, and you set good examples for one another. One of the movements I have a tremendous amount of respect for that I spend way too little time on in the Gorwthbusters documentary is transition towns, the transition movement. Look that up, Google that. Look for, if you're in the United States, look at transition, I think it's transition.us. Or look for a transition network. And in many communities around the world now, there are transition towns, and there are groups of people who are working together to try to develop a healthy local economy that doesn't depend on profligate burning of fossil fuels.
Mm-hmm.
It's trying to develop a post-carbon economy, an economy that's increasingly local and less global, so that we get reconnected with the impacts of our behaviors, and we aren't burning a lot of carbon shipping products halfway around the world, including food. Mm-hmm. Local food movement. I guarantee you, you'll see more and more local food advocates in communities across the U.S. where they're trying to make it so that your food was grown 10 miles from your home instead of 1,500 miles, which is the current average. Mm-hmm. There are some very smart economists working on the economy at a bigger public policy level that so far they're not really giving you a lot of tools to work locally, but you might learn something from the New Economic Foundation and the Next System project. I would look those up.
Okay.
Post Carbon Institute has a great website called resilience.org, which again, that is national and global information and information sharing, but frequently they offer information that you can use at a local level. And there's some guys in Australia, the Simplicity Collective, and there again, they do not have chapters around the world, but if you find the Simplicity Collective, start reading what they write, and even look at their new documentary. You might even arrange a screening in your community of their new documentary. That can start people in your community thinking a little bit differently about how, really, it turns out that the good life is not based on more and more of everything year after year. We've basically been chasing for 100 years. We've been chasing all the wrong things.
Yeah, people are chasing this Pokemon now.
Yeah, and we're on a
what's that?
That's a good way to put it.
What's that?
We're on a treadmill. Yeah, we're on a treadmill. We're working too hard. We're not. The things the most enjoyable things in life do not cost money.
Yeah.
They really just come from slowing down and living at the speed of nature. And it turns out if the more that we can do that, the less damage we're doing to the planet, and it gives us a chance to leave a world worth inheriting for our children just by slowing down and stepping off that treadmill.
Yeah, I heard a question that somebody had asked Steve Jobs, and he was dying with cancer, and somebody said to him, "What would you do if you could do it all over again?" And I think he said it was something along the lines of, "I would work less and spend more time in nature," and that's it. right there. I mean, it's obviously it's important for people to work and maintain their lives, but it's just we've been over consumed and overworked, and there's really no time to really step back and appreciate what we have here. Our heads are in our phones, on our computers, just all in the wrong places. Um,
I'm reminded of, there's another podcast I didn't mention in a radio series that I've been producing called Conversation Earth, which you were probably trying to get me to mention. And there's an episode of Conversation Earth with Rex Weiler. And Rex was one of the original co-founders of Greenpeace International. And he lives in Vancouver, Canada. He's been an environmental journalist all of his life, and he's a brilliant man. And I would really recommend, if you go to conversationearth.org, and there are 18 great episodes there, but particularly look for the one with Rex Weiler. And there's this great moment in that interview where he just says, "You know what? I'm happiest just sitting on the front porch with my kids strumming my guitar. That's what makes me happy. Yeah. I don't need to be not need to be making more money. I do not need to have a trophy house or a vacation home in the South and another vacation home in the North." And it's that old cliche, no one on their deathbed ever wishes they spent more time at the office.
Yeah, absolutely.
What would you wish for? As you mentioned, Steve Jobs so eloquently spoke. Yeah.
I think that's a great way to finish it up there. Or great words to finish it up. What would you wish for? I think I want to thank you, Dave. It's been an absolute pleasure to interview and discuss these things with you today. Is there anywhere that people can come to learn more about the work that you've done? Watch the movie that you've produced?
Sure. For the movie, Growthbustersmovie.com is a great place to start. Worldpopulationbalance.org for the World Population Balance Organization has really great information about overpopulation, and in fact the frequently asked questions section of that website is particularly well done. And then conversationearth.org to discover that Conversation Earth series that I just mentioned. Those are three good places.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again, Dave, and I hope to have you back on in the very near future. There's a lot to talk about. Unfortunately, we can't squeeze it in all into one show, but we'll talk to you again in the near future, Dave. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. I want to compliment you on what you're doing. I hope you're very successful, and anything I can do to support this great conversation that you're trying to have, I would be glad to do.
Well, that's great.